I took my wife's LOVRS wife to a party, and what followed was devastating. It started with one text, a message that shattered my world in a single moment. I thought we were a team, but behind my back, a second life was unfolding, full of secrets I never imagined. This isn't just a story about betrayal, it's about how I fought back. Stay with me. Because what happens next will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about trust. I'll never forget that morning, the sunlight slanting through the half-closed blinds, the quiet murmur of traffic down below, the comforting aroma of coffee brewing in the kitchen. For years, those sounds, those smells, that rhythm, it was my life. Steady, predictable, solid. I'd always believed I'd built something unshakable. Vesper and I had been together for over a decade. I thought I knew every inch of her, every smile, every slight tilt of her head that hinted at a private joke only we shared. But that morning, something changed. Something small. Something I almost ignored. I noticed her phone, left casually on the counter. That alone should have struck me as odd. Vesper never left her phone lying around. She always had it on her, slipping it into her pocket, or dropping it into that sleek leather bag she carried everywhere. Her phone was like a third hand, always within reach. But not that day. That day, it sat there, screen dark, as if daring me to look. At first, I brushed it off. I wasn't one of those paranoid husbands. I never felt the need to check her messages or wonder who she was texting. We were solid. At least, I thought we were. But as I stood there pouring my coffee, the phone lit up. Just a quick flash. Enough to catch my eye. And in that brief moment, I saw it. A message. Just a few words. Can't wait to see you tonight. Same hotel. My stomach tightened. I remember standing there, mug in hand, staring at that screen like it was a live grenade. A part of me wanted to put it down. Forget I'd seen it. Convince myself it was some misunderstanding. Maybe a friend was joking around, or she had plans I'd forgotten about. But deep down, I knew. My gut. That instinct I'd honed over years of business deals and boardroom battles, told me otherwise. I reached for the phone. My hand was steady, but my pulse was pounding in my ears. I told myself I'd just look at that one message. Just enough to put my mind at ease. But once I started, I couldn't stop. I opened the thread, and suddenly it was all there, dozens, maybe hundreds of messages. A record of stolen moments, whispered secrets, carefully planned encounters. My breath caught in my throat as I read them. Names of restaurants I'd never been to, places I'd never heard of, plans made under fake names, candlelit dinners, weekend trips, intimate words exchanged with a familiarity that made me sick. This wasn't a fling. This was something else. Something bigger. Something that had been going on long enough to have a routine, a rhythm, a life of its own. And then I saw his name. Lysander Vale. I'd met him before, more than once. We moved in the same circles: charity galas, networking events, those insufferable black tie dinners where everyone smiles through their teeth and pretends to be best friends. I'd shaken his hand, laughed at his jokes, even clinked glasses with him. And all the while, he was sleeping with my wife. I felt my chest tighten, my hand gripping the edge of the counter to keep from shaking. I thought of every moment I'd trusted her. Every time I'd turned to her for support. Every time I'd confided in her. Every time I'd looked at her and thought, this is the person I'll spend the rest of my life with. And now, I wasn't even sure who she was. The sound of her footsteps on the marble floor pulled me out of my thoughts. Vesper breezed into the kitchen, her hair still damp from her morning shower, her expression as calm and composed as ever. She smiled at me, leaned in to kiss my cheek, and I stood there, frozen, barely able to meet her eyes. Did she know? Did she suspect I'd seen something? But she didn't hesitate. I'm meeting the girls tonight for dinner, she said casually, reaching for her keys. Don't wait up. She smiled again and turned to leave. It was so natural, so effortless, like nothing was wrong. And for a brief moment, I wondered if I'd imagined it all. If maybe there was some explanation. But the messages I'd just read were still burned into my mind, and I knew I couldn't unsee them. I knew something was deeply, irreparably wrong. As the door closed behind her, I stood there in silence. The coffee had gone cold in my hand. My pulse was still racing, my thoughts a chaotic blur of questions I couldn't answer. Why? How long? Did she ever love me at all? Or was I just some convenient placeholder, while she lived a double life? The trust I'd always taken for granted had been shattered in an instant. And yet, I didn't confront her. Not then. Not right away. Because part of me wanted more than just an explanation. Part of me wanted to understand the full scope of what I was dealing with. Part of me wanted revenge. I couldn't just sit there. The moment Vesper walked out the door, I set my coffee down and started pacing the apartment, my mind racing through a million questions at once. Who was she meeting? Was she actually going to see the girls, or was that just another lie? My heart was pounding, my breathing shallow, and every time I tried to convince myself that it was a misunderstanding, those messages came back to me. Each line burned into my memory like a brand. I thought about picking up the phone, calling her right then and there, demanding an explanation. But what would she say? She'd deny it, surely. Maybe she'd cry, maybe she'd try to turn it around on me. How dare you look at my phone? How dare you not trust me? And then what? I'd be right back where I started, unsure if I'd learned anything at all. No, that wasn't the way. I needed more. I needed to be sure. I needed to know exactly what I was dealing with before I confronted her. I wanted the whole truth, and I wanted it on my terms. I grabbed her phone again. This time I wasn't just skimming. I scrolled back through months of messages, my fingers flying over the screen. The further back I went, the more it confirmed what I'd feared. This wasn't new. This wasn't some passing fling or a drunken mistake. Vesper and Lysander had been carrying on for at least a year, maybe longer. My stomach churned as I read through their exchanges. They talked about everything: dinners, hotels, weekend getaways to places I'd never even heard her mention. I found details about the restaurants they went to, reservations made under aliases, the hours they spent together in boutique hotels, while I was working late or out of town on business trips. She was meticulous in her planning, careful to cover her tracks, but not careful enough. I saw something else, something I hadn't noticed at first. Lysander wasn't just her lover, he was a liar and a cheat in every sense of the word. Between their intimate messages, there were scattered references to moving the funds and keeping things under wraps. I didn't understand it all right away, but it was clear that their relationship wasn't just personal. It was financial. My mind raced back to the few times I'd met Lysander at that gala 2 years ago, at the charity event last fall. I remembered shaking his hand, making small talk. He had seemed charming enough, smooth, confident, the kind of guy who never seemed rattled. Now I wondered if all that charm was just a facade. He wasn't just sleeping with my wife. He was using her, and maybe even using me. A thought struck me. What if Lysander's connection to Vesper wasn't just an affair? What if he was manipulating her for access to something more: my money, my business contacts, my reputation? I ran my hand through my hair, trying to make sense of it. The messages hinted at investments and opportunities, but nothing concrete. I needed more than a few cryptic lines to figure out what they were up to. I needed real evidence, something I could hold up in front of Vesper and Lysander that would make them squirm. My phone buzzed on the counter. It was a work email, some client needing a quick response. For a second, I almost ignored it. My world was falling apart, and the last thing I cared about was work. But then I realized something. My work was the key. My position, my resources. I had the tools to dig deeper. I spent the rest of the morning poring over everything I could find on Lysander. He wasn't hard to track down. He had his fingerprints all over the city's social scene. The guy was everywhere, smiling in photos at fundraisers, giving interviews about his firm's success, rubbing shoulders with the kind of people who never had to worry about their next paycheck. On the surface, he looked like the model of success. But as I started digging, cracks began to appear. I found mentions of lawsuits that never made it to court, rumors of settlements quietly swept under the rug. His company's financial reports didn't quite add up, minor discrepancies that might have gone unnoticed to the average person. But I knew how to spot them. I'd built my career on reading between the lines, on noticing what others missed. And Lysander's life was full of lines that didn't connect. The more I found, the more I realized that his relationship with Vesper might not have been about love, or at least, not just about love. It was about leverage. The hours ticked by as I pieced together the picture. I could feel the walls of my once perfect life closing in. My mind kept replaying every memory I had of Vesper. How long had she been laughing at me behind my back? How many of our conversations, our dinners, our private moments were a lie. The anger came in waves. Sometimes it was a sharp, hot burst that made me want to smash something, anything. Other times, it was a slow, simmering burn that made my hands tremble as I held my phone or scrolled through the files on my laptop. I kept expecting to feel numb, to go cold, but that never happened. The pain stayed sharp and constant, a reminder of how deep the betrayal cut. I thought about calling a friend, someone who could talk me down, help me think straight. But who could I trust? My closest friends were also friends with Vesper. How could I know if they were in on it, if they had covered for her? The thought made me sick to my stomach. For the first time in my life, I felt truly alone. Even my own home didn't feel safe. I stared out the window at the Manhattan skyline, wondering how many of those shining windows held their own secrets, their own betrayals. How many other people were out there feeling like this right now? The thought was strangely comforting and horrifying all at once. By late afternoon, I realized I needed help. Not from a friend, not from a therapist, but from someone who knew the game, someone who had been in my position. That's when I thought of Elowen, Lysander's wife. I'd met her a few times at events. She always seemed distant, polite but not overly warm. At the time, I thought she was just reserved, the kind of woman who preferred to observe, rather than be the center of attention. Now I wondered if she'd been keeping her distance for a reason. Had she known all along? Was she in on it? Or was she as much a victim as I was? I hesitated before reaching out. Involving her felt like crossing a line. But then I thought about the messages, the lies, the years I'd wasted trusting someone who didn't deserve it. I couldn't do this alone. If Elowen was anything like me, she'd want to know the truth. And if she knew the truth, maybe she'd be willing to help. I found her contact information in an old event directory, and sent a message. Just a few words. Enough to let her know something was wrong. Enough to let her know she wasn't alone. I stared at the screen after hitting send, wondering what would happen next. Would she reply? Would she be furious? Would she tell me to leave her out of it? I didn't know. All I knew was that this wasn't just about me anymore. It wasn't just about my marriage, or my pride. It was about taking back control. If Lysander and Vesper wanted to play games, they had no idea who they were dealing with. Just when I thought I had uncovered all the lies, I found something that changed everything. But what would you do if you were in my shoes? Would you confront them head on and risk it all? Or would you wait for the perfect moment to strike? Let me know in the comments, 1 for confronting them now, 2 for planning a calculated revenge. My first move was to gather everything I could find: messages, photos, receipts, anything that might prove what I already knew in my gut. I had to tread carefully. If I acted too soon, I risked tipping them off. I couldn't have Vesper or Lysander getting ahead of me. I needed time to piece together the full picture, to understand how long this had been going on, where they had been, what they had done. The more I looked, the more it all fell into place. Little things started to add up. Unexplained charges on our credit card statements. Suspiciously long work trips that lined up with Lysander's out-of-town conferences. Even subtle shifts in Vesper's behavior. I remembered her coming home late, claiming she'd stayed late at yoga or grabbed drinks with friends. Back then, I'd believed her. I never thought to ask more questions. Why would I? She always seemed so composed, so sure of herself, as though her life with me was exactly where she wanted to be. But now I saw it for what it was: a well-rehearsed act, a polished performance designed to keep me in the dark. One night, I sat at my desk with her phone in one hand, and my laptop open in front of me. I'd set up a private folder, hidden deep in a directory I knew she'd never find, and began to save everything. Screenshots of their texts, screenshots of their photos. I even printed out a few of the most damning messages, careful to keep them hidden away where she'd never stumble across them. With every new piece of evidence, I felt that sharp pang of betrayal all over again. Each word, each image was a fresh wound, a reminder of how thoroughly I'd been deceived. It wasn't just the fact that she was cheating, it was the extent of it, the sheer scale. This wasn't a fling. This wasn't a one-time lapse in judgment. Vesper had built a second life, a secret life, and I was just the oblivious husband left standing in the wreckage. I thought back to all the times I'd seen Lysander at social events, shaking hands with people who had no idea who he really was. He was always charming, always the life of the party. He made people laugh, made them feel important. He had this way of looking at you like you were the only person in the room, like every word you said was the most fascinating thing he'd ever heard. At the time, I thought it was just charisma. Now I saw it for what it was, manipulation. He'd used that same charm to win over Vesper, to pull her away from the life we'd built together. But it wasn't just charm, it was something deeper. He'd promised her something I hadn't, a sense of adventure, of spontaneity. He'd made her feel special in a way I hadn't in years. That realization stung, not because I thought it excused her behavior, but because it forced me to confront the cracks in our marriage. I couldn't help but wonder, if I'd paid more attention, if I'd been more present, would she have turned to him in the first place? The answer didn't matter now, but the question still haunted me. As I dug deeper, I found more than just the affair. I found evidence of something much bigger. Something I never saw coming. Vesper and Lysander weren't just meeting up for secret trysts. They were making plans. Financial plans. Investment plans. They talked about accounts I'd never heard of, funds being transferred, deals being made. I didn't understand all the details at first, but the pattern was clear. They were building something together. Something outside of me, outside of us. At first, I thought maybe Vesper had been duped. Maybe Lysander was using her, manipulating her into moving money, or signing off on deals she didn't fully understand. But as I read more, it became clear that wasn't the case. Vesper knew exactly what she was doing. She wasn't a pawn, she was a partner. That was the hardest part to swallow, the realization that she wasn't just cheating on me. She was betraying me in every way that mattered. She was helping Lysander steal from me, from my business, from the future we built together. I kept going, hour after hour, digging through everything I could find. My office became a war room. The desk, once a place for work and late-night brainstorming sessions, was now covered in printed emails, credit card statements, and a detailed timeline I'd started to piece together. I traced back every trip, every charge, every unexplained absence. I wanted to know the exact moment it all started. I wanted to pinpoint the day Vesper first crossed that line, the day she decided to betray me. I thought if I could find that moment, maybe I could understand why she'd done it. But the more I looked, the more I realized it didn't matter. The why wouldn't change what had happened. The why wouldn't bring back the years I'd spent trusting her, loving her, believing in her. At some point, I stopped looking for answers and started looking for ammunition. This wasn't just about knowing what they'd done. It was about preparing for the confrontation. I knew I couldn't rush it. I needed to be methodical, deliberate. If I confronted her too soon, I risked losing the upper hand. I needed to wait until I had everything. I needed to wait until she couldn't deny it. So I kept going, kept gathering, kept building my case. Each new piece of evidence brought me closer to that moment, the moment when I'd finally lay it all out in front of her, and watch her carefully constructed lies come crashing down. In the quiet hours of the night, when the city outside was still, and the apartment felt too big, too empty, I'd catch myself staring at the wall, replaying the memories of our life together. The vacations, the holidays, the late nights talking about our dreams. All of it felt so distant now, so unreal. I wanted to hate her. I wanted to feel nothing but anger. But deep down, there was still that part of me that missed the woman I thought she was. I hated myself for it. I hated that I couldn't just turn off those feelings, that I couldn't just walk away without looking back. But I knew I couldn't let that weakness show. Not now. Not after everything I'd seen. If I wanted to come out of this with any sense of dignity, I needed to stay strong. I needed to keep my emotions in check. Because this wasn't just about my marriage anymore. This was about reclaiming control. About showing her and Lysander that they hadn't won. They thought they could fool me. That they could take what was mine and get away with it. But they were wrong. They had no idea what I was capable of. Eloane Vale was a name I hadn't thought much about until that afternoon. She was a fixture in our social circles. A quiet presence at galas and fundraisers. Often standing just a step behind Lysander, her husband. In hindsight, I couldn't help but wonder if that quietness was less about shyness, and more about careful observation. She never seemed fully engaged in those conversations over cocktails, or charity auctions. While the rest of us laughed and nodded, trading compliments and business tips, Eloane watched. She didn't say much. I used to think she just wasn't interested in the game we all played, the posturing, the social maneuvering. But now I wondered if she had simply known something the rest of us didn't. As I sat at my desk, staring at her name in the event directory, I hesitated. Reaching out to her felt risky. What if she didn't know? What if she was as in the dark as I had been? But on the other hand, if she did know, if she was sitting in her townhouse right now, grappling with the same betrayal that had blindsided me, then she might be the only person who could help me figure out what the hell was really going on. I tapped out a message, kept it short and simple. LON, we need to talk. It's about your husband. After a moment's hesitation, I hit send. I half expected it to go unanswered. Or worse, for her to respond with anger or confusion. But to my surprise, the reply came back almost instantly. Come to the townhouse tonight. We'll talk then. The words were clipped, to the point, with no hint of shock or denial. If she was blindsided, she wasn't showing it. When I arrived that evening, her home was as pristine as I remembered. The kind of place you see in high-end magazines, perfectly curated furniture, every piece chosen with care, nothing out of place. It was almost unnerving. My own apartment, while expensive, always felt lived in. This felt more like a showroom. Eloan met me at the door, her expression unreadable, her dark hair swept back from her face, her green eyes sharp and direct. She didn't bother with small talk. Come in, she said simply, leading me into a sitting room. The furniture was arranged like a stage set, the lighting dim, the walls lined with art I didn't recognize. She gestured for me to sit, then took the chair across from mine. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. She studied me as though trying to decide how much she could trust me. Then, finally, she broke the silence. What do you know? Her voice was calm, but there was an edge to it, a subtle challenge, as if daring me to tell her something she didn't already know. I took a slow breath. I know that my wife has been having an affair with your husband, I said evenly. Her expression didn't change. No gasp of surprise, no flash of anger. Just a small, almost imperceptible nod. I know they've been meeting in hotels, exchanging messages. I know they've been making plans, financial plans. Moving money, talking investments, using resources that don't belong to them. I paused, watching her reaction. Nothing. It was as if I were reciting the weather report. And I know, I added, that they're not just cheating on us. They're scheming together. She leaned back slightly, folding her arms across her chest. And how much of that do you have proof of? Her question caught me off guard. I expected her to ask why I was telling her, or what I planned to do about it. But she went straight to the evidence. That told me something. She wasn't going to take my word for it. She wasn't the type to fly off the handle without facts. She wanted proof. Cold, hard proof. I've got messages, I said. Screenshots. Hotel reservations. Financial records that don't add up. It's all there. She nodded again, slowly this time. Good, she said. Because I have some things too. She stood and crossed the room to a small, elegant desk. She opened a drawer and pulled out a sleek black folder. As she set it on the coffee table between us, I couldn't help but notice how steady her hands were, how calm she appeared. She opened the folder and began to slide out papers, bank statements, emails, transaction logs. Cassian, she never called him Lysander. Always Cassian is a master at covering his tracks, she said. But even masters slip up sometimes. I've been collecting this for months. I wasn't sure what I was going to do with it, but then you reached out. She looked up at me, her green eyes locking onto mine. So, here we are. I flipped through the documents. She wasn't kidding. These weren't just hints or suspicions. These were direct links, payments routed through shell companies, accounts under false names, large sums that disappeared and reappeared in places they shouldn't. It was enough to make my stomach turn. How long have you known? I asked. She hesitated, then said, I started noticing things about a year ago. Changes in his schedule, expenses he couldn't explain. At first, I told myself it was work. Stress. But then there were messages on his phone. Messages like the ones you found. She glanced down at the folder. Once I started digging, it became clear. This wasn't just an affair. It was something else. I sat back, the weight of it all settling on me. We weren't just dealing with infidelity. This was a coordinated, calculated operation. What's his endgame? I asked. What's he trying to do? Elowen shrugged, a small, bitter smile tugging at her lips. Power, control. He's always needed to feel like he's one step ahead, like he's untouchable. The affair was just another way to assert that control over me. Over Vesper. Over you. But the money? The deals? That's where he really thrives. He's building a safety net, a way out, something that leaves him holding all the cards when everything else falls apart. Her words hit me harder than I expected. This wasn't just about betrayal anymore. It wasn't just personal. It was about control, manipulation, greed. It was about taking everything that mattered to me in my marriage, my trust, my stability, and using it to fuel his own ambition. I looked up at Elowen, and for the first time, I felt a flicker of something other than anger. I felt solidarity. We were both trapped in the same web, both blindsided by people we thought we knew. What do we do now? I asked. She met my gaze, her expression steady, her voice calm but firm. We use what we have. We don't just confront them. We take them down. As she spoke, I realized something. I wasn't alone in this anymore. And for the first time since this nightmare began, I felt like I had a way forward. We spent the next several hours laying the groundwork. It was one thing to know the truth, to see the messages, the transactions, the lies laid bare, but it was another to turn that truth into action. Elowen and I weren't just comparing notes now. We were building a plan. We couldn't rush it, couldn't risk making a mistake. If we moved too soon, they might bury everything, wipe the digital traces, smooth over the cracks. We needed to be methodical. Elowen was the first to suggest surveillance. It wasn't as dramatic as installing hidden cameras or hiring private investigators, but it was smart and subtle. She knew Cassian's schedule better than anyone. She knew his routines, the places he frequented, the times he was most likely to slip away. We start by mapping out their movements, she said, her voice steady. If we know where they're going, we can predict their next move. And if we can predict their next move, we can get ahead of them. It made sense. If we were going to take them down, we needed to anticipate their every step. I agreed, but I also knew that surveillance alone wouldn't be enough. We needed something more concrete, something they couldn't explain away. I started digging into Vesper's financial records again, going deeper than I had before. It wasn't just about finding suspicious transactions anymore, it was about connecting those transactions to Cassian. I needed to see exactly how he was using her to move money, how he was funneling it through accounts and companies, how he was leveraging their relationship for his own gain. Every time I found another connection, I felt that familiar mix of anger and determination. The more I uncovered, the clearer it became. This wasn't just about infidelity. This was about power, control, and exploitation. Elowen was relentless. She didn't just sit back and let me do the digging. She brought her own files, her own notes, her own observations. We spent hours cross-referencing what I'd found with what she already knew. She pointed out inconsistencies in Cassian's business dealings, little discrepancies that might have seemed minor on their own, but took on new meaning when viewed alongside the messages and the transfers. We weren't just piecing together their affair, we were unraveling a much bigger web. As the night wore on, I realized just how much Elowen had been holding back before. She wasn't as calm and detached as she had seemed when I first showed up at her door. Beneath that polished exterior, she was just as angry, just as hurt, just as determined as I was. It wasn't that she didn't feel the betrayal, it was that she refused to let it control her. "I'm not going to let him win," she said at one point, her voice low but firm. "I've spent too many years living in his shadow, believing his lies. Not anymore." I felt the same way. I couldn't let Vesper and Cassian walk away from this unscathed. They had spent so long spinning their lies, so long believing they were untouchable. But we were closing in on them now. Every piece of evidence we collected, every connection we made, brought us closer to the moment when we'd finally confront them. I didn't know exactly how that confrontation would play out yet, but I knew one thing for sure: it wouldn't be pretty. In the early hours of the morning, Elowen and I sat at her dining table, surrounded by printouts, notebooks, and laptops. The air was heavy with exhaustion and determination. We had mapped out Cassian's upcoming schedule, identified his most likely meeting spots, and listed the financial records we still needed to track down. It was a daunting task, but I felt a strange sense of clarity. For the first time since this nightmare began, I had a direction. I wasn't just reacting anymore, I was acting. I was taking control. Elowen poured herself another cup of coffee and leaned back in her chair. "We're going to need more than just documentation," she said, her voice thoughtful. "We need witnesses. People who can corroborate what we found. Former employees, business partners, anyone who's seen something but hasn't spoken up." I nodded. She was right. Documentation was powerful, but first-hand accounts would make our case even stronger. It wouldn't be easy. Cassian and Vesper had been careful, and many of the people around them might be too afraid or too loyal to speak out. But if we could find just one or two people willing to come forward, it could make all the difference. We made a list of potential contacts, names from Cassian's firm, people who had left under suspicious circumstances, former clients who might have noticed something was off. I took note of a few names from our social circle as well. Maybe there was someone who had seen Vesper and Cassian together, someone who had picked up on the signals I'd missed. It was a long shot, but we had to try. The more we talked, the more I realized how much I relied on Elowen. She had an eye for detail, a way of seeing connections that I might have overlooked. She wasn't just my ally in this, she was my partner. We were in this together, and we both knew what was at stake. This wasn't just about getting even. It was about reclaiming our lives, our dignity, our sense of control. By the time I left her townhouse, the sun was starting to rise. The city was waking up, its streets slowly filling with people heading to work, to school, to their daily routines. I felt a pang of envy as I watched them go about their lives, unaware of the betrayal and chaos I was dealing with. But at the same time, I felt a flicker of hope. I wasn't powerless anymore. I wasn't just sitting back, letting things happen to me. I was fighting back, step by step, piece by piece. As I walked to my car, I thought about what we'd accomplished that night. We had a plan. We had evidence. We had a list of people to contact, a timeline to follow, a strategy to execute. It wasn't perfect, and there were still so many unknowns. But it was a start. And after everything I'd been through, that was enough. For now. I didn't go home right away. I drove aimlessly for a while, the city a blur outside the windshield. My mind was racing, every turn of the wheel feeling more like autopilot than any real sense of direction. The early morning light reflected off the glass of the skyscrapers, making the city feel like it was caught somewhere between night and day. Much like I was stuck between who I used to be and who I was about to become. I kept replaying the conversation with Elowen, the evidence we'd uncovered, the names we'd written down. It was all there, right in front of me, but instead of feeling relief at the clarity, I felt a mounting pressure. I had to keep it together. For all the control I thought I was regaining, I knew one wrong move could unravel everything. I couldn't afford to stumble, not now. When I finally parked, it was in front of a coffee shop I used to visit every Sunday morning. Back then, it was a peaceful ritual, grabbing a dark roast, settling into the corner seat by the window, and reading the news on my phone. Vesper had come with me sometimes, though she'd usually leave early to run errands. I wondered now if those errands had been the start of something else. Pushing that thought aside, I stepped inside, the familiar smell of freshly brewed coffee and baked goods washing over me. The place hadn't changed much, the same warm, amber lighting, the same worn wooden tables, the same quiet hum of conversation in the background. I ordered a coffee, black, and took it to the corner table. This time, though, I wasn't there to unwind. I pulled out my laptop and began going through the list we'd made, searching for anything that could strengthen our case. I started with the former employees. It didn't take long to find a few names that stood out. There was a paralegal who'd left suddenly, right around the time. Some of the more suspicious transactions started appearing in Cassian's records. Her LinkedIn profile mentioned that she had transitioned to a new field, but a quick search on social media showed a different story. She'd posted about being pushed out of a workplace she once loved. And though she didn't mention Cassian's firm by name, the timeline matched up perfectly. Another name led me to a financial analyst who had been a part of a major project Cassian spearheaded a few years back. He'd left under what the firm called amicable terms, but there were rumors, hushed whispers of disagreements over financial reporting, discrepancies in the numbers that didn't add up. These weren't smoking guns on their own, but they were leads, and that was enough to keep me going. Between sips of coffee and long stretches of scrolling through old posts and buried articles, I started to see a pattern. It wasn't just about Cassian's greed or his arrogance. It was about the way he covered his tracks. He didn't just burn bridges, he made sure those bridges were impossible to cross again. Every departure, every amicable separation, left a trail of people who were too scared or too worn down to speak out. That was his strategy. Keep everyone quiet. Keep everyone afraid. But if even one of them was willing to talk, willing to confirm what Eloin and I already suspected, then we'd have something no one could ignore. The hours passed in a haze of research and notes. By the time I looked up, the coffee shop was nearly empty, the baristas wiping down tables and stacking chairs. I closed my laptop, shoved it into my bag, and headed out. The sun was higher now, the city fully awake. The streets were alive with the usual hustle, people rushing to work, delivery trucks idling at curbs, cabs weaving through traffic. But for me, it felt like the calm before the storm. I wasn't just preparing for a confrontation, I was preparing for a reckoning. And with every new piece of information I found, I felt the anger rise again. Not the wild, directionless anger I'd felt when I first discovered Vesper's betrayal. This was different. This was cold, focused, and deliberate. It was the kind of anger that makes you sharper, more precise. The kind that makes you see clearly what you need to do next. I went home and spread out all the notes and printouts on the dining table. The apartment was eerily quiet. No music playing, no footsteps in the hall, no clinking of dishes in the kitchen. It was just me, the evidence, and the ticking of the wall clock. I didn't feel the same way about this space anymore. It used to feel warm, comfortable, a sanctuary from the chaos of the world. Now it felt like a reminder of everything I'd lost. Every corner of the apartment, every piece of furniture, carried the weight of memories I didn't trust anymore. But that was fine. I didn't need comfort right now. I needed to stay sharp. I needed to stay focused. I picked up my phone and called Eloin. She answered on the second ring. I found a few leads, I said without preamble. Former employees, people who might be willing to talk. I'm not sure how much they'll say, but it's a start. Good, she replied. Her voice was calm, steady, the way it always was. Keep digging. I'll reach out to some of my contacts as well. If we can get even one or two of them to come forward, it'll make all the difference. We talked for a few more minutes, going over what we had so far, what gaps still needed to be filled. By the time we hung up, I felt a strange mix of exhaustion and energy. The day wasn't over, but it already felt like I'd lived through a week. I stood at the window, looking out at the city, letting the noise and movement wash over me. This wasn't just about Vesper or Cassian anymore. This was about making them face the truth, making them feel the weight of their actions. It was about finally taking back control. I turned away from the window, my mind already moving to the next steps. There were still so many questions, so many pieces of the puzzle that hadn't fallen into place yet. But we were getting closer. Every lead, every piece of evidence brought us one step closer to the moment when the lies would crumble and the truth would stand unshaken. And when that moment came, they wouldn't just see what they'd done to me. They'd see that I wasn't the man they thought I was. I wasn't the man who would sit back and let it happen. I was the man who would make sure they paid for it. When the night of the gala finally arrived, the city was alive with movement. The streets bustling with honking taxis. Well-dressed crowds streaming toward the glittering event venues. I had spent days preparing for this moment, running through every possible scenario in my head. Every word I might say, every look I might give. But now, as I stood outside the Grand Hotel entrance, a sea of lights above me, I felt something unexpected. Calm. Not the kind of calm that comes from confidence, but the quiet stillness that comes from knowing there's no turning back. The decision had been made, the lines drawn. All that was left was to walk inside. The lobby was a masterpiece of polished marble and gold accents, filled with the soft murmur of voices, the gentle clinking of glasses. It was the kind of place where appearances mattered, where every detail from the chandelier's sparkle to the crisp folds of a tuxedo was carefully curated to signal power and wealth. I recognized some of the faces immediately, executives I'd worked with, acquaintances who knew my name but not my story. They nodded, smiled politely. To them, I was just another guest, another figure in a sea of success. None of them knew the storm that was about to unfold. As I made my way to the ballroom, I scanned the room for Vesper. The plan was simple: let them see me before I said a word. Let the sight of me remind them that their perfect facade wasn't so perfect after all. I didn't have to look long. Vesper was near the bar, laughing at something one of her friends had said, a glass of champagne in her hand. She was radiant, every inch the woman I had married. Her smile as dazzling as ever. If I didn't know what I knew, I might have felt a pang of pride seeing her there. But all I felt was a hollow ache, a reminder of everything she'd taken from me. I didn't approach her right away. Instead, I walked over to one of the side tables and picked up a glass of whiskey. The weight of the glass felt steady in my hand, the burn of the liquor sharp but grounding. I let my eyes drift across the room, taking it all in, the mingling guests, the laughter that floated just above the music, the conversations filled with empty pleasantries. I wondered how many of these people had their own secrets, their own hidden betrayals. How many of them were wearing masks, as well crafted as the one Vesper had worn with me. She spotted me before I made a move. Our eyes met across the room, and for a brief moment, I saw a flicker of something surprise, unease before she quickly masked it. She smiled, her lips curving into that effortless expression that always seemed to say, "Everything is fine." She raised her glass in a small toast, as if we were nothing more than casual acquaintances at a pleasant event. I raised mine in return, giving her a slow, deliberate nod. Let her wonder what I was doing there. Let her feel the shift, the crack in her perfect evening. It didn't take long for her to make her way over. As she approached, she moved with the same grace that had once captivated me. Her dress flowing around her like liquid silk, her heels clicking softly against the polished floor. "Thorne," she said, her voice warm, almost too casual. "I didn't know you'd be here tonight." I smiled faintly, sipping my whiskey. "I figured I'd stop by. Couldn't miss the party, right?" Her expression didn't falter, but I could see it in her eyes, the slight narrowing, the quick glance over her shoulder. She was calculating. "It's good to see you," she said, placing a hand lightly on my arm. The gesture was friendly, familiar, as if she were trying to bridge the distance between us. "You look well." "Thanks," I said. "So do you." For a moment, we stood there, the two of us locked in a quiet dance of unspoken words. I could see the questions behind her composed exterior. Why was I here? What did I know? But she wouldn't ask. Not yet. She was too careful for that. The sound of laughter broke the tension, and we both glanced toward the bar. Cassian was there, holding court with a group of colleagues, his smile wide, his posture relaxed. He hadn't seen me yet. For all his charm, all his swagger, he was blissfully unaware of the ground shifting beneath him. I watched him for a moment, letting the sight of him cement my resolve. This wasn't just about revenge. This was about truth. About making them both face what they had done. "Excuse me," Vesper said suddenly, her voice smooth. "I need to say hello to someone. But we'll catch up later, won't we?" "Of course," I replied, my tone as calm as hers. She walked away, her movements deliberate, her head held high. I knew she'd head straight for Cassian. She'd warn him, try to keep him calm, try to figure out how much I knew. That was fine. Let them scramble. Let them try to prepare. It wouldn't change what was coming. I stayed at the edge of the room, keeping my distance, watching the two of them from across the crowd. Cassian's expression shifted as she spoke to him, his easy confidence giving way to a flicker of tension. He glanced my way, and for a moment, our eyes locked. His smile didn't waver, but I saw the shadow behind it, the realization that I wasn't just another guest. I raised my glass to him, the faintest tilt of my head, and then turned back toward the bar. The evening continued, the music growing louder, the conversations more animated. But beneath the surface, I could feel it, the tension, the unease. I stayed in the background, moving through the crowd like a shadow, always watching, always waiting. They couldn't ignore me. They couldn't pretend I wasn't there. And with every passing minute, the weight of their lies grew heavier. When the time finally came to make my move, I felt that same strange calm settle over me. I stepped into the light, into the heart of the ballroom, and let them see me fully. Vesper and Cassian froze, their smiles fading, their polished masks slipping. And in that moment, I knew, they could feel it too. This wasn't going to end the way they'd planned. This was just the beginning of the end. The tension in the air was almost tangible as I moved through the crowd, each passing face a blur of glittering jewelry and perfectly tailored suits. I kept a measured pace, blending into the sea of guests who sipped champagne and traded polite laughter. Though my mind was razor-focused, Vesper and Cassian had retreated to one of the side lounges, a quieter space draped in soft lighting and elegant furnishings. From a distance, I could see them standing close, their postures stiff, despite the air of casual conversation they were trying so hard to maintain. They didn't know it yet, but this was the last time they'd stand so comfortably in the glow of their carefully curated image. The cracks in their facade were already showing, and I wasn't going to stop until I pulled it all apart. I stopped at the bar again, not to drink but to watch. The bartender set another glass of whiskey in front of me without a word. I didn't touch it. Instead, I let my eyes roam over the room, catching glimpses of people whispering, their curious glances darting toward Cassian. Word was spreading faster than I'd anticipated, the subtle shift in the room's energy unmistakable. Eloan's presence only heightened the tension. She was standing near the back, the picture of elegance, a slight, knowing smile on her lips as she watched the scene unfold. Her confidence was contagious. I knew she had already set things in motion, and I knew that whatever happened next, she would handle it with precision. For now, it was my turn to step forward, to deliver the blow that would shake the foundation of their deceit. As I approached, Cassian spotted me first. His eyes narrowed, his mouth tightening in a forced smile. He leaned closer to Vesper, whispering something I couldn't hear, his hand lightly brushing her arm. She turned slightly, her expression shifting when she saw me. For a fleeting moment, I thought I caught a glimpse of fear in her eyes, but it was gone in an instant. Vesper had always been good at hiding what she was really feeling. She smiled, cool and collected, and tilted her head as if to say, "What a surprise." But it wasn't a surprise, not really. She had seen the look in my eyes earlier, and now she was bracing for whatever came next. "Thorn," Cassian said as I stepped closer, his voice smooth but carrying a sharp edge. "I didn't expect to see you tonight." "Really?" I replied, my tone light but my gaze steady. I figured it was the perfect occasion to reconnect. Vesper's smile faltered just slightly, a twitch at the corner of her lips that she quickly masked with a laugh. "Of course. It's been too long since we've all been in the same room." I let the comment hang in the air. Let them feel the weight of what I wasn't saying. Cassian cleared his throat, shifting his stance. I could see the calculation in his eyes, the wheels turning as he tried to determine how much I knew, and how much I was going to say. Vesper reached for her glass, her fingers trembling ever so slightly as she lifted it to her lips. I didn't need to call them out yet. They were unraveling on their own, their carefully rehearsed composure slipping with every passing second. I took another step closer, lowering my voice just enough so that only they could hear. "We need to talk." Cassian tensed, his jaw tightening as he glanced around the room. "This isn't really the place. I think it's exactly the place," I said, cutting him off. "But if you'd rather go somewhere more private, I'm fine with that." Vesper's voice was a soft plea, almost a whisper. "Thorn, please. Can we not do this here?" "Do what?" I asked, feigning innocence. "I'm just trying to have a conversation." The flicker of panic in her eyes told me everything I needed to know. She wasn't sure how much I was going to say or how far I was willing to go, and that uncertainty was tearing at her. I stepped back slightly, giving them just enough room to feel like they weren't trapped, but I kept my gaze locked on theirs. "We'll talk later," I said, my tone steady, calm. "Enjoy the rest of your evening." I walked away before they could respond, leaving them standing there with their masks cracking and their confidence shaken. The ballroom felt different now, the laughter and music distant and muted. People glanced at me as I passed, some with curiosity, some with knowing looks. The whispers were growing louder, rippling through the crowd like an unseen current. This wasn't just about the lies anymore. It was about the collapse of the image they'd worked so hard to maintain. And I wasn't finished yet. By the time I reached the edge of the room, I could feel the shift in the atmosphere. Cassian and Vesper were no longer the center of attention. People were starting to talk, guests exchanging quiet words, their expressions ranging from mild surprise to outright suspicion. I didn't need to say anything to the crowd. The seeds had been planted, and they were growing on their own. I turned my gaze back toward Eloan. She met my eyes and gave a subtle nod. Everything was going according to plan. We had done what we set out to do. We had taken the first step in dismantling their carefully constructed world, and there was no stopping what came next. As the night wore on, the ballroom's energy began to shift. The once vibrant air of celebration and networking was now heavier, weighted down by the growing whispers and subtle glances. I could see it in the way people moved, in the way conversations grew shorter, in the way eyes darted toward Cassian and Vesper, before quickly looking away. The cracks in their facade weren't just showing, they were spreading. What had begun as a private storm between the three of us was now spilling out into the crowd, rippling through the room like a low, persistent rumble of thunder. I made my way toward the back of the ballroom, where Elowen waited, her posture composed, her expression unreadable. She didn't have to say anything for me to know that she'd seen it too. Every forced smile on Vesper's lips, every strained laugh from Cassian, it all painted a picture of two people desperately clinging to control. And it wasn't working. Elowen stepped closer as I approached, her voice low and steady. "They're starting to feel it." I nodded. "Good." We stood there for a moment, side by side, watching the ballroom from the shadows. It felt like standing on the edge of a precipice, knowing that once we took the next step, there'd be no going back. The plan was in motion, the timing had to be perfect. But the satisfaction I expected to feel was strangely absent. I thought I'd feel triumphant seeing them squirm, watching their carefully constructed world crumble around them. Instead, all I felt was a quiet sense of finality. This was the endgame, the moment we had been working toward. And when it was over, there would be nothing left of the life I had once known. Elowen's voice cut through my thoughts. "What now?" I glanced at her, the faintest smile tugging at the corners of my mouth. "Now we let them make their move." It didn't take long. Vesper, ever the strategist, began making the rounds, pulling aside familiar faces. No doubt spinning some story to keep the wolves at bay. I watched her carefully, noting how her tone shifted depending on who she spoke to, how her expression softened for some, and sharpened for others. She was still trying to control the narrative, still trying to salvage what she could. But the room wasn't responding the way it once had. People were listening, sure, but they weren't nodding along with the same easy confidence. There was doubt in their eyes, a hesitation that hadn't been there before. Vesper was good, but the truth was louder than her charm. Cassian, on the other hand, looked like a man on the verge of unraveling. He lingered near the bar, a glass of scotch in his hand, his shoulders stiff. Every so often, his gaze would sweep the room, landing on me, on Elowen, on anyone who might be whispering about him. His usual air of arrogance had faded, replaced by something more vulnerable, more desperate. I could see him trying to keep it together, trying to project the image of a man in control. But the cracks were too deep now. He was holding on by a thread, and he knew it. I caught his eye and held his gaze for a long moment. He didn't look away, neither did I. There were no words exchanged, no gestures. Just the unspoken understanding that he knew what was coming and he knew I wasn't going to stop until it all came crashing down. As the evening drew to a close, I found myself back at the edge of the ballroom, nursing a drink I barely touched. Elowen was still nearby, her presence a steady reminder that I wasn't alone in this. Together, we had set this in motion, and together, we would see it through. But as the final chords of the band's music played and the guests began to filter out, I felt a weight settle over me. This was it. The grand finale. The moment when all the pieces would fall into place, and there'd be no more pretending, no more hiding. I took a slow breath, steadying myself as Vesper and Cassian made their way toward the exit. They walked together, close enough to appear united, but the tension between them was unmistakable. They hadn't noticed me standing there, just out of sight. I watched them leave, watched as they stepped into the cold night air, their faces set, their shoulders tense. I knew what awaited them when they walked out that door. The whispers wouldn't stop just because the night had ended. The questions wouldn't go away. The truth had a way of following you, no matter how fast you tried to run from it. Elowen appeared at my side, her voice quiet but firm. "It's done." I nodded, but the words didn't feel as final as they should have. Instead, they hung in the air, heavy and unresolved. "What happens now?" She gave me a long look, her green eyes sharp and unyielding. "Now they have to deal with the fallout." I knew she was right. The damage was done, the foundation cracked. But as the ballroom emptied out and the noise faded, I couldn't help but wonder what came next for me. I had spent so much time focused on exposing them, on tearing down their lies, that I hadn't thought much about what would happen when it was all over. When the storm passed, would I feel free? Or would I just be left standing in the wreckage, unsure of where to go from here? The silence of the empty ballroom was almost deafening. The lights dimmed, leaving only the faint glow of the chandeliers above. I stood there for a moment longer, letting the stillness settle around me. I thought about the life I had before this, the life that had seemed so stable, so unshakable. I thought about the nights I had spent sitting at this very bar, laughing with friends, looking across the room at Vesper, and thinking how lucky I was. It all felt so far away now, like a story someone else had lived. As Elowen placed a hand on my shoulder, a quiet strength in her touch, I realized that this wasn't just an ending. It was a beginning. A chance to rebuild, to start over. But that didn't make it any less daunting. The path ahead was uncertain, the steps I needed to take still unclear. But for the first time in a long time, I wasn't afraid to face it. We left the ballroom together, stepping out into the brisk night air. The city stretched out before us, the streets alive with motion and light. I could hear the faint hum of traffic, the distant chatter of people heading home. It was a reminder that life moved on, even after the hardest of nights. And as I walked away from the hotel, away from the lies and the betrayal, I knew that I had a choice. I could let the past define me, or I could take control of what came next. For now, I chose the latter. And so, I had a choice: let them walk away, or make sure they never forgot the price of their betrayal. But the question remains, did I go too far? Did justice turn into revenge? Share your thoughts below. Would you have done the same, or would you have taken another path? I'm curious, what would you do if it were you? Trust is a fragile thing. My experience taught me that no matter how solid something appears on the surface, whether it's a marriage, a partnership, or a handshake deal, it can all unravel when deception enters the picture. It's a harsh reminder that blind trust leads to blind spots, and those blind spots can cost you dearly. Always pay attention to the details, question what seems off, and never be afraid to confront the truth. If there's one lesson I've learned, it's this: being vigilant isn't paranoia, it's self-preservation. And in a society like ours, where appearances often overshadow reality, that vigilance is what keeps us grounded.